So in the last video, I told you that you were dependent upon the oil companies. Nowhere around it, nothing you can do about it. It's just the way that it is. Sorry, you might as well just suck it up and accept the fact that you are reliant on oil. And if you want to drive around into an electric car and you want to feel good about your life, then that's great. But you need to understand that those indirectly are still related to the oil industry. And even so, if you're not putting gas in your vehicle, guess what, folks? You're still relying on the oil companies in other ways, not necessarily just fuel. So, are there other early fuel sources that were here, that were present, that did things for us before gasoline came into the picture? And the answer is yes, of course. You know there were, right? So, we need to talk about what they were. And this is the first one. Fish oil. In particular, whale. Imagine an environmentalist now. Okay, folks, do you want us to go out and hunt whales so we can have whale oil to do things with? Or do you want us to stick something into the ground and suck up the crude oil that we can use for many different purposes? Well, whale oil was not the only one. All right, and what you're seeing on the screen right now are just different bottles of sperm oil or whale oil that was back in the day. It was used for a number of different things. Everything from as simple as lighting a lantern was all whale oil based. This was very common in the 1700s. Before that, though, fish oil like tuna oil was also very common. This began in about the 1200s and it lasted for a couple hundred years before whale oil came along, and that became competitive in the 1700s. And before that, olive oil was actually pressed, as you can imagine, in ancient Greece. And this oil was also used for many different purposes. And guess what? You've used olive oil. We've talked about olive oil. We talked about adding it in food as flavor. We never really talked about it in terms of a fuel, but it is an oil. And it could be used in fuel with certain modifications and the right type of, quote, technology during that time. So this was kind of our early stages. It wasn't really crude oil. It wasn't these big conglomerate oil companies or these big billionaires like Chevron and BP that was controlling things back in the day. It was kind of man. They would go out. They would harvest this oil and bring it in. And this is what they began to use. Well, were there other sources of oil? Were there other sources of fuel? And the question is absolutely. Especially in the South. And in the South, we had these pine trees that were great. We could go around and tap the pine trees. And when we tapped the pines, we could basically seep out the pine tar. This was very common during the 1200s, 1300s, and this is also where we get the slogan of Tar Heels. That's right, North Carolina. That's where that name comes from. Why? Because we had a lot of tar farmers, and it was a very sticky substance, and it would drip from the trees in the buckets that they would have it in, and it would get onto the ground, and they would step in it. So their heels became very sticky. And that's kind of how the name came around. They were tar heelers. Well, this was a major industry for the South, all the way 1700s and up. We began to extract pine sap, and in this pine sap, we had a few chemicals that we could isolate from it. One of them was turpentine. And turpentine was used for lamp oil. So as you can imagine, before electricity hit, well, we had to light up the night, right? And we did that through lanterns. We did that through lamps. And turpentine was one of those products that could do that. Well, it just so happens that when we're talking about the South and we're talking about pine trees, North Carolina became a very big player in this. And the ports of Brunswick, 1727, and the port of Wilmington, 1739, handled most of the exports that were going on in the South. 1770s, North Carolina had 70% of the tar exports and 50% of the turpentine exports that were going on. The problem is that we began to wipe out the longleaf pine, which is the very common pine tree that was here when this tapping was done. So there was a cost. This area boomed. The workers here boomed. This was a common substance that people wanted. But we had to do so in exchange for wiping out the longleaf pines. This was an energy source. Again, I'm an environmentalist. I'm protesting the oil companies, and I'm telling them, no more oil, no more oil. Well, which one do you choose? Would you like for us to continue to tap the pine trees and continue to kill them and continue to chop them down and wipe them out? Or would you rather for us to dig a hole in the ground and suck up the crude oil and use that for multiple purposes? Your choice. Which one do you want? A or B? Now, is that my only option? Well, at this time, it kind of was. So which one do you want? Well, I've got some pictures here. Here's a what we would call a naval store. And the naval stores were this name that was given to basically these areas that would go around and bottle or barrel this kind of merchandise up. And this merchandise, of course, were things like turpentine and the pine sap and everything else that people could do things with. So as you can tell, this was a huge industry. It was a huge moneymaker. It put a lot of people to work, but it did kind of destroy some areas that it began to take over as well. This picture just so happens to be the port of North Carolina in Wilmington. So this picture is basically a image of people that are at this naval yard, and they are barreling this merchandise up and loading it up onto a boat. And I think they said that this picture was actually a boat from Germany. So this was an area that was selling. It was a product that was selling. It was a moneymaker. It put people's food on the table. And this was just the way of life back in the day. And this picture was taken 1870s. So it gives you an idea that this industry really stayed around for quite some time, even here locally around the Cape Fear region. But was this your only source? Right? I mean, as you can tell, we've had a few options on the table now. Neither one of them were actually perfect. So are there other sources of fuel? And the answer is yes, and that's electric. But you're thinking, well, wait a minute now. You know, you're talking about electric and you're talking about electric vehicles. Electric vehicles, that was like 2000s. This is 1870, right? Well, no, actually not. That's a misconception that many people had. Our first electric vehicle happened in 1830, not 2000. Our today's climate did not make the first electric vehicle. Sorry, folks, I hate to burst your bubble. This was nothing new that we just decided to come up with. This was not new technology that man or woman decide to make to improve our lives and to get rid of the oil dependence. Electric vehicles were actually the first one created in the 1830s. Folks, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, sorry, they beat you to it. Today's generation of folks working in the industry of energy, you did not do this technology. Somebody beat you to it. And that was William Morrison. William Morrison, Des Moines, Iowa, created the first electric vehicle. The issue is that, yeah, sure, it got 14 miles per gallon, or 14, not miles per gallon, but miles per hour. That should be an mph. It didn't go very fast, but it still was electric. 1890s, New York City was actually flooded with electric taxi cabs. You might not believe it, but they were. They were out there. They were electric. They weren't really running off of oil and gasoline. 1900s, electric vehicles, they represented 1/3 of all vehicles that were on the road. 1900s. 1900s, we had the technology to get away from gasoline. 1900s, we had vehicles that were electric. 1900s, 1/3 of the vehicles on the road were electric. These electric vehicles were very common in areas that had resources to electricity, of course, during this time. Not everyone could have one. Not everyone had electricity in their homes or where they lived, but it was becoming more and more common. And the picture that you're seeing right now is William Morrison on his electric vehicle back in the day. Again, it didn't go very fast, but who cares? If it was this or horse and buggy, this, you didn't need any horses. This was perfect and geared toward women. You didn't have to worry about the horse. You didn't have to worry about strapping everything in. This was an electric vehicle. This was something that you could actually use and not worry about. You just have to drive it. You could imagine the convenience that happened with the electric vehicles, and that's why it kind of took off during the time when it was made. Here are a couple of more pictures. Now, over the years, more and more people got access to electricity. More and more people could have bought this electric car, but there was a problem. This electric vehicle wiped out. Sorry. Why? Well, the answer here is the Model T was released. Ford came along and made Model T, but you're questioning, well, wait a minute. This Model T, it wasn't electric, right? Was it? The answer's no, it wasn't. But the Model T actually was cheaper. You could go and purchase Model T for half the cost that you could purchase this electric vehicle from Morrison. And because of that, the electric vehicle faded away. This was cost-driven. People did not care about the environment. People did not care about the industry. People didn't care about this idea of energy or energy reserves. People cared about the pocketbook. Here we have a car that's fully electric that not everyone has access to at the moment, but it's fully electric, and this is costing double than what the gasoline vehicle would cost. So, if I had money and I wanted a vehicle, I wanted a car, I didn't want my horse and buggy anymore, then I would fork out less money to purchase a Model T. Or I could purchase 2 Model Ts for the price of that one electric. And as you can imagine, the electric vehicle faded away. The same kind of thing happened here in the 2000s. I don't know if you remember cars like the Chevy Volt, but these were fully electric vehicles or hybrid electric vehicles that were released onto the market. They were great. They were built up. Oh gosh, we're getting rid of oil. No more oil. Gas is too much at the pump. We now have these vehicles that are fully electric. We plug them into the outlet, which requires oil, but we'll plug them into the outlet and we become oil independent. Wrong. The same story happened, folks. Things like the Chevy Volt and other cars that were related costed so much money. I mean, you're looking at $40,000 and $50,000 for the vehicles when they were first released. Who's going to go and spend $40,000 and $50,000 on a vehicle just because it's electric when they can still go out and buy a gasoline-based engine car and pay half the price? We don't learn from history. This already happened. This already happened over 100 years ago, and now we are going to repeat ourselves? What didn't we get the first time around? And again, that was the decline of the electric car over 100 years ago. Wallet, pocketbook, price point. I think you know where I'm going to go with this. I hope, if you're paying attention. All of the fuel world, and again, we're talking about biofuels. We haven't made it there yet. But the fuel world is going to be based on the dollar. And this is going to be the common trend from this point on. So in order for us to talk about biofuel, and again, biofuel is something that comes from maybe food. In order for us to talk about why this even exists, we have to talk a little bit about the history of gasoline. And that's what we're doing now. So in the next video, we'll kind of figure out what happens next. Here we had the birth of the electric car. That's right. Again, it didn't happen in the 2000s. This is old technology that was just brought back. The introduction of the electric car, the death of the electric car, the introduction of the gasoline-based vehicle that was half cost, and people began to buy and people began to drive. So in the next video, we'll continue on and we'll talk about other fuel sources. What else was going on during this time in this gasoline boom, in the vehicle boom? What was going on that we need to talk about? And that's what we'll do next in the upcoming video.